I mean, I think we all agree with George's comments that we've got to be doing, as it were, the grand challenge and working together. It's not just chemistry, it's across the university. My problem more is, are the scientists the people who are going to actually change it? Or do we, and because if we want to get to this, getting them to do the bigger picture, many of them are very happy not doing that because it's very, very comfortable and they're not being challenged. And probably the route is not through the university. It's a far more draconian viewpoint from above. Listen, your universities have got to wake up, you've got to start doing this or you're not getting any money. Do we think that that's the route, or do we think that the scientists have the capacity to change themselves, given the track record, and really make a momentum towards the grand challenge? I'm wondering what the panel thinks about that.
So I actually have thoughts on this. I think, you know, we've basically in this country got a system set up that rewards small parcels of research. And I think it's all about the metrics, or the KPIs, if you want, that we're given. And, you know, we all evaluate our grants from the number of papers. We get Hertzie allocation, or your allocation with the government based on, up until the last election, the number of papers, and there's a direct correlation with the number of papers we output in the institution of that scheme. So I think it's about rewarding big picture science, not rewarding incrementisation of science.
I guess the follow-up question though is that how could we do that? Andy, you have any thoughts? No.
I'll give Andy the tough question.
Polly, can I make one remark that also is to the previous remark? There's one component we've left out of this, which is small companies and startups. Yeah. Big companies have the characteristic that they have low cost of capital, that is enormous resources, lots of really good engineers, and the ability to deal with problems that universities can't deal with. And universities have the ability to do new stuff. And you know, if you're working in a big company, you're normally not encouraged to do new stuff. We're encouraged to make the stuff that you have work better. And finding ways of putting those two together in a more productive way is a worthwhile thing. For those of you who are maybe haven't thought a lot about this, my rule of thumb is to go from the laboratory to an actual product with the beginning of a market, which is where society begins to see what's going on, is a 15-year project, and it costs a minimum of $100 million. And I think that's almost universal. It happens pretty much everywhere, with the possible exception of software. And you know, that amount of money only comes if you are involving the capitalist system in some way. And usually the best way of involving the capitalist system, I think, is by working with small companies who put life in, for them it's a life and death issue.
I think that's an interesting proposal, but also for us, we've been criticized for not having that level of industry engagement. So the starting point is industry engagement, but that also depends on having a community that values what each party can bring to it. So again, we probably, for us, it's a question of starting with education. We have now, I think, fewer than 50% of the final year, year 12 pupils studying STEM subjects. That's dropped in the last 12 years, about 10%. So from the Academy of Sciences point of view, we're investing quite a lot of time and money in both primary and secondary education in inquiry-based learning. Then I hope we'll have a community which starts to value that, and then we can go forward with the opportunity of collaborating with our industrial partners. But we have to have a positive engagement. In Scotland, there's an interesting organization called Relate or something like that. It's not quite, where it started with a group of 3 people, and now I think it's a group of 15. Shaban Jordan is the person leading it. Some of you might have met her. She was here recently. I think they're contributing now something like many tens of millions of pounds to the Scottish economy by having brought together industry, the small industry, and the researchers in a whole lot of subjects. The other thing I think Alan's touched on that's important is we are now, and George has mentioned it, we're in an environment where it's not sufficient just to be good at STEM subjects. You have to have a package of talent which embraces the whole of knowledge in order to succeed in an enterprise.
So, I mean, can I make the point then, I mean, continuing from everything we've talked about here, that if we are going to enable this to happen at the grassroots level, and everyone needs to feel that it's not just about understanding the STEM subjects, but really understanding the holistic, right? Because you've got to make things work. If we're talking about startup companies, you've got to make things work on a commercial level, so you've got to understand, you know, is this ever going to work in practice, and all of those types of things. can we ask the question, how many of our, early career researchers generally take the time to actually then get out of their comfort zones? And that's really the question. So we've addressed the issue of taking, young kids and students across and getting them to see industries. We've agreed that industry engagement is important. So then I suppose the question is, should we be expecting our early career researchers to go down that path and take that upon themselves and continue to have that industry engagement? Or if they haven't had that opportunity, then to create those opportunities to go out and do it, because that's how, one, you figure out what the problems might be, the point that George raised earlier. Then you go out there and seek funding and opportunities and create that pathway to, hopefully see your research actually solve a whole range of different problems. But unless and until you're actually doing that proactively, how do you even sort of have that understanding of what the world actually needs and what the problems are? So I suppose that's probably an important question, because I can sort of make the point that, if you look at what's required in an engineering context to graduate, even with, the difference between, and forgive me if I'm going to probably say something to offend chemists in the room, but so you can go, oh, that engineer, gosh, should have never let the engineer in the room. In engineering, to get an accredited Bachelor of Engineering degree, you need to be able to do 12 weeks of industrial training at the undergrad level. When I did my own grad work in Michigan, it was expected that you were going to actually spend some time with industry and you're going to experience. I call that my immersive experience, because unless and until I went through that really, really difficult experience, because when you're out there working in the field, you're basically having to take charge of your own project and run it. Do we actually have something equivalent, I guess the question is, in chemistry, where you're expected to pick up on a couple of these other things outside your comfort zone, that is outside the space of your research and what the research would expect you to do in terms of what we've talked about before, publish papers, present at conferences, do all of the things. So it's not to say you would stop doing that. It is over and above all of those things that you have to do as a researcher. Question is, are we creating those other opportunities? I leave that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I don't know if we really encourage it all that well in chemistry. A lot of us have looked at placement programs to put students in placements in higher level, or the higher levels of their undergraduate. Finding the companies that will take these people is pretty difficult. But at the same time, Justin's point where we put a lot of metrics on things for early career researchers, it almost goes against that, because you're going to be taking time and losing out on the metric side of things. So we don't really encourage it all that well. I don't think it's something that's got to change.
No, I want to go back.
Yep.
So I just have this idea that I trot out every now and then to anybody to listen, and I serially get ignored.
You've got a few people here.
But there's this question about start-up industries, and because we do have to change the way our economy works, because it's very much a commodity-based economy. It's not really a technological-based economy. And how do you change that culture? And so the idea I had a number of years ago was, I'm an academic. I do run a research group. When I had the idea, I taught. Do administration. Then to start a startup company is actually adding maybe a fourth job. And of course, I've got a lot invested in being a professor, so maybe I'm not the right person to do that. And so my idea was, the people that should best start these startup companies are the students that come out of the lab that essentially got nothing to lose. And my idea was, why don't we have a granting scheme where you have venture capitalists and people that come out of the lab, they create their business model, they pitch their idea, and the guys that win actually get fellowships for a couple of years to start their startup company. I think things like that would start at least getting the idea that, that sort of approach is beneficial for people.
So, I mean, exactly right. That, so coming back to the 2 points that we've just heard, it is really about metrics, isn't it? I mean, if you keep saying that the metrics is really very sort of one-dimensional, and you don't take into account the ability and the capacity to do the kinds of things that we've just heard, go off and, create your startups and, have experiences outside the university, whether you call it industry engagement or go and volunteer and help another startup company and can learn from their successes and failures. Either way, what we are really asking, students and early career researchers and those applying for fellowships, et cetera, to do is go out and try other things that are not part of your traditional sort of comfort zone, and therefore are there metrics that we can help define, and that's really how do you do that?
Can I just,
Yeah,
well, it
yeah, I know.
actually then addresses the other problem of sort of placements, because one of the first student I guided who started a startup company did some of the work here in Australia and then went to Boston to start the startup company. They just basically, all these people put things on lab equipment for free, and they took everything from there. And to establish, their business models and getting all market surveys and stuff, they got all these students from Harvard and MIT that wanted to have that sort of experience. That's how you get your